I'm here today to tell you that homelessness does not have to be hopelessness. I want to share with you two stories that reveal the essence of human potential and that demonstrate that no human being should ever be forsaken. Two stories, one of prevention and one of redemption. The first story involves a 17-year-old young woman from Sacramento. Let's call her Claudia. When she was 14 years old, after a relatively normal childhood, she began hearing voices taunting her, telling her to harm other people. She believed there was a parasite that existed in her body. Her appearance became disheveled and she could no longer handle school. And in fact, at 14, she dropped out of school. Fortunately, she found her way to an innovative clinic at the University of California at Davis called the EDAPT program. And in that program, she was given very low doses of psychotropic medication, intensive individual and family therapy. And her symptoms began to recede. So much so, and gradually better, that by the end of her 16th year, by the time she became 17, she was back in school full-time, had an active social life, is graduating high school this year, and is planning to go to college without any symptoms and without any fear that she is going to have a relapse of those symptoms. That's prevention. The second story is about redemption. It involves a 43-year-old man whose real name I can use, by the name of Chow. Chow was a refugee from Laos who was brought to this country at age 2 without his parents and lived in California's foster care system where he was the victim of tremendous trauma and abuse. He somehow made it through childhood, but by the time he got to his late 20s, he was not well. And when he became 33, hearing voices and being tortured with the memories of his past, Chow ended up on the American River in Sacramento, homeless, and remained homeless for 2 full years until he was rescued by another program that reaches out to the homeless mentally ill and provides shelter and permanent housing. And when Chow first got into housing, he would only sleep in the closet because he was fearful that others would attack him. But he got better, and he graduated from emergency housing to transitional housing. And now he's 43 years old, and he lives independently. He still has support, and he works in the very program that helped save his life. And he's considered the single best volunteer the program has. He plants trees, and people say his enthusiasm for life is infectious. It may seem like a fantasy, but what if we had state and national policies which said we are going to do everything in our power to prevent people who may be predisposed or likely to suffer from serious mental illness, from having to suffer the most severe consequences? And if we had a state and national policy that said it is our duty to reclaim the lives of those who have fallen through the proverbial cracks and ended up on the streets. It may be a fantasy to some, but to me it is not. For we can do this if only we have the commitment and the will to do more of what we know works. In 2004, the voters of California passed the Mental Health Services Act, known as Proposition 63. It was a millionaire's tax before its time, and its funds are dedicated exclusively to building up the public mental health system in our state. It's the only kind of its program in the country, and it's helping people like Claudia and Chow throughout our state. It generates $2 billion a year, and 25% of that money every year must be spent on prevention and early intervention, 75% on the back end, services for people who need them the most. The clinic that benefited Claudia was funded in part and is based on a model that Prop 63 is funding throughout the state called the Early Psychosis Intervention and Treatment Program. And its premise is very simple. If a teenager who, because of family history or behavior, is suffering or at risk of suffering, the program gets them into care and treatment early. Again, as in Claudia's case, low doses of psychotropic medication and therapy. 17 counties throughout California are piloting this approach. 5 states in the country are doing the same. And though we are still early in the experiment, the early evaluations show that, like Claudia, people are staying in school. Their symptoms are receding. And maybe most significantly, over time, they are not suffering the terrible consequences of untreated mental illness. Now, I said 25%, 75%. I think it should be the goal of our state and our country to say, let's spend 75% on prevention and early intervention, so we only have to spend 25% on services for those who fall through the proverbial crack. For not everyone is as fortunate as Claudia or Chow. We know that in California, and by the way, this is a problem that exists throughout the country, that in California, on any given night, there are 50,000 homeless people who suffer from mental illness. And I know there are many reasons for homelessness, but I don't care what the statistics say. If you're out on the street for a long period of time, if you didn't suffer from serious mental illness when you got out to the streets, you suffer from mental illness because you've been on the streets. And a lot of people suffer from the dual diagnosis of mental illness and substance abuse. We know what works. It's intensive outreach. It's not here, can I offer you a cup of coffee, would you come into treatment? Many people are in fact treatment resistant because they're afraid. It takes intensive outreach that can last months before the right relationship is developed so that the person feels comfortable coming into treatment. It takes intensive services, of course. Prop 63 is currently funding 35,000 of these so-called whatever it takes service approach. And then it takes housing. This is so obvious and common sense, it shouldn't even have to be argued. But if Chow did not have emergency shelter, transitional housing, and then permanent housing, he would have undoubtedly cycled on and off the streets, ended up in the hospital, and might not even be alive today. And yet in this city, in this state, and in this country, we have a shortage of housing. Any given night in the capital city, there are 2,500 homeless people and only 600 shelter beds, and not nearly enough permanent housing for the people who need it. So we're taking the millionaire's tax in California, and we are saying, let's take and set aside 7% of the money And let's bond against that 7%, and let's create a $2 billion capital fund for permanent housing, which, by the way, can be leveraged 4 or 5 to 1 and create $10 billion worth of capital so that communities can actually take what we know works and build and retrofit and rent the housing that is necessary if we're going to be serious about ending the blight of homelessness in our state and in our country. You know, it's a well-known truism for people who may know little about California history or even U.S. history. They know this. They know that about 4 decades ago, it was then Governor Reagan, and it was the same policy nationally, that made the well-intended decision to shut state mental hospitals. I say well-intended because One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was really not fiction. It was pretty true. The well-intended decision to shut state mental hospitals and to allow people with mental illness to live with dignity in our communities. And when you go back and look at the records of that period of time, the state made a promise, as the country made a promise. The state said, we will replace 90% of the cost of hospitalization and put it out into community services. And the state never did so. And as a result, we see the consequences. We know 3 things about this issue. We know mental illness, while the homeless may be the most visible manifestation of untreated mental illness, this is about us and our families. Everybody knows somebody. Everybody knows somebody. Secondly, this issue is connected to every major public policy issue that we try to tackle and aren't very good at tackling. Whether it's homelessness, whether it's criminal justice and the people who cycle in and out of our jails, whether it's family dysfunction, whether it's kids who fall behind in school because they have a behavioral issue that hasn't been diagnosed. I'm still trying to figure out the connection to climate change. I haven't figured it out yet, but we're on our way. There must be. And the third thing that we know is, despite facts 1 and 2, how pervasive this is and how connected it is to every other issue we spend a lot of money on but can't seem to solve, it gets very little political attention. So I ask you, are you ready to step up and tell people in positions of authority and power to use the social media, to use all of your means of communication to say that preventative mental health and mental health services themselves must be a top-tier priority in our society? Are you ready to do that? Yes. Are you ready to help bust the stigma that still exists around these issues? We talk now about cancer freely. We talk about diabetes. When somebody, God forbid, has a heart attack and they're rushed to the emergency room of a hospital, there's no question that there's a bed for them. When somebody is rushed to the hospital under a so-called 5150 in California, more often than not, they linger in the hallway of an emergency room because, quote, there's no beds. Parity in the insurance law cannot just be a word. We have got a fight on our hands in this country to make the mind equal to the body. Social movements happen when people decide they want them to happen. Let's make this one happen and end the incredible amount of unnecessary suffering that goes on for too many people, for too many families. Mental illness does not have to be a life sentence of unemployment, of disconnection and dysfunction. The flip side of disability is ability. Let's do this together. Thank you. Thank you.